Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our illustrious president, Patsy Costello, and she's going to introduce our speakers tonight.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. I'm going to introduce our speakers tonight that are going to talk about the Quaker Crum Elbow Meeting House. Carol Beck is one of our members, and she was born and raised in Dutchess County. She developed an early interest in history when listening to the stories told by her grandfather. Both Carol's and her husband's ancestors were Quakers. Her husband's great-great-great-grandfather, John Briggs, actually built the addition on the Crum Elbow Quaker Meeting House. Carol has served as a trustee of the Crum Elbow Rural Cemetery Association for many years and currently also serves on the Restoration/Preservation Committee. Our second speaker is Denise Schaefer Burns, who was born and raised in the Crum Elbow neighborhood and is a graduate of FDR High School, as were her parents. Though she is a registered nurse by profession, she has always had a passion for local history. 2 years ago, she offered to chair a committee for the preservation of the Crum Elbow Meeting House as it became more apparent it was in need of repairs. A condition assessment has recently been completed by a local contractor with expertise in preservation. Please help me welcome Carol and Denise.
Thank you. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the history of the meeting house, and then Denise will go more into the actual restoration and preservation of the project. In fair old Dutchess County, where the air is ever sweet, stands a landmark of the ages where the quiet people meet. 'Tis the old Crum Elbow Meeting House, the worshipers are friends. This was from a poem by Harry T. Briggs. These friends came to our area here in the late 1700s. They came from New England, many from Rhode Island, and even some from Long Island. They settled into what was then the town of Clinton. It's now Hyde Park, but at that time it was the town of Clinton. They actually attended the Friends Meeting House at Clinton Corners. As their numbers grew, they started meeting in their homes. Now you're going to find some discrepancies with dates here because we got different dates. We got 1797, which we think is when they started to build the first meeting house, part of the meeting house, and 1798 when they completed it. But you'll also see 1785. And so we're not really sure if that's when they started thinking about building it or when they actually came to the area. So there are some discrepancies in dates, but we're going to go with 1798 when the first portion of the meeting house was completed. Now, unfortunately, when this was copied, it was a little distorted, okay, because it's actually more rectangular and lower. So if you can picture that, there are some pictures over there that'll give you a better representation. And there also is another door, like in between those two windows there. So, but the first part, when they decided, after meeting in their homes, and they decided to build another meeting house, it was going to be in the Crum Elbow area. And the Crum Elbow original part, which is the west wing, which would be on your left. Okay, so that was, just picture that, just that portion, those two windows and that door, okay, on that left. It was a wood structure. It was 2 stories, but it was an exception because most meeting houses were rectangular, and this one was squarish. It was undivided, but it did have the 2 stories. About 12 years later, as the congregation grew, they decided they needed to add to the meeting house, and that was in 1810. And at that time, okay, that would be the side that's on your right. So that's the side over here that was added. And if you look and see, it's almost a mirror image. Not quite, but it is almost a mirror image. And at that time, it achieved conformity with the traditional form when it was enlarged in 1810. The traditional form was rectangular in shape, 1 or 2 stories in height, and it had separate entrances for men and women. And you can't see the one door because it's kind of behind the column there, but there are 2 doors there. Balance and symmetry was part of what was part of the meeting houses, other meeting houses, and now this also had balance and symmetry. There originally was also a carriage or wagon shed that was off behind it. That was taken down at some point in time, and I'm not sure when. This also has the 2 chimneys, which were there. They were taken down after 1950. They are not on the meeting house as it stands today, but they are on this particular picture here. The building is divided down the middle. It has a mobile type of partition that you can raise and lower, and that was to divide the section that was for the women and the section that was for the men. Because as they came up there and they drove their wagons, and you can see the little stoop there, and that's how they got off of the carriages and their wagons, okay? The women would go in one door, and the men would go in the other door. And the children would always stay with their mothers, so they were not with the men. They're also, okay, and I'll show you this. In fact, if you want to put up the next picture, please.
I have a question. Did a man lead the meeting house for the women? Was it a man that led that meeting, or was it a woman that led it?
Okay, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, okay? This is the inside. You can see one staircase on that side. There's also a staircase on the other side. That particular staircase was the men's side. As you can see, it's a banister. And I just learned a fact for myself. The other side had what they called a modesty panel, which meant if the women went upstairs, okay, you could not see their legs, okay, and that portion of their body, where the men just had the banister. If you look toward that's the back here, okay? There are some raised benches. That's where the elders, the overseers, and if there was a minister, the minister would sit up there. There wasn't always a minister. So they would sit up there. The regular benches was for the congregation. Now these benches...
2 things. Here's a pointer. First button. Second thing, be consistent, hold the microphone.
Okay, thank you.
Don't turn away from it.
You can't hear me then.
It's not going to be very good what I'm doing.
Okay. I'm not sure how to use this. Okay. All right. These benches here were made of wood. The backs were about 90-degree angles. So you can imagine how you were going to sit in this bench. Now here you see cushions. Those cushions were added later. There were no cushions originally. You sat on the hardwood with your back straight, and you sat there for approximately an hour for a service. So it wasn't terribly comfortable. The interior, okay, was usually not painted, but in some instances, like with Crum Elbow, they did whitewash it, and Crum Elbow was whitewashed. I just want to give you a story that's kind of come down through the Briggses, okay? My husband is a descendant of the Briggses. So when they decided to build the second section in 1810, the members had decided that the old original meeting house was too small and no longer supplied the needs of their fast-growing congregation. Therefore, they had called a meeting to organize and provide ways and means for the new addition. After calling the meeting to order and selecting a chairman, there was a long silence in the proceedings. Finally, John Briggs arose and said, "Well, gentlemen, thy shirts cling very close to thy backs. I'll give you $10. And so began the final stage of the present building, which was the second stage. And John Briggs actually tried to help to build that. The Friends worship in an unprogrammed style. The worshipers silently sit upon waiting upon God, okay, to give them a message. At times, a worshiper will break the silence of the meeting to share the message. There's no music, there's no sermon, not as we look at what a church service is today. They possibly could have sat there the whole hour and no one said anything. Their faith was a faith of simplicity, justice, and peace. In 1828, a philosophical difference split the Quakers into two fractions, the Orthodox and the Hicksites. About this time, George Hicks, a leader with the Hicksites, spoke at the Crum Elbow Meeting House, and the congregation chose to follow the interpretation of the Hicksites. Now, the major difference between the Orthodox and the Hicksites seems to be that the Hicksites were more rural. They were farmers. They wanted to actually stay with the more conservative. And the urban, okay, the Orthodox were more urban. And they actually started to follow the Bible and actually made some changes in their services that were more church-like. By 1890, the members of the Quaker congregations were declining. Now, in 1829, there were as many as 204 members at Crum Elbow. But by 1890, this had declined significantly. In 1913, ownership of the building and its associated cemetery grounds were transferred to the Crum Elbow Rural Cemetery Association for $1. Next photo, please. Pardon?
Were the Hicksites fixed?
Okay, as I said, in 1913, the Crum Elbow Rural Cemetery took over the association. And if you look down in the corner here, down here, these are actually members, trustees of the board. And this was approximately 1933. And you might recognize some of these names if you're old Hyde Parkers. Sterling Barrett, Theron Browning, Stuart Briggs, Lewis Ring, Jess Briggs, Theron Marshall, and Edgar Briggs. So if any of you have been in Hyde Park for a long time, you probably recognize some of these names. The meeting house stands guard over the rows of headstones bearing fine old family names. Names that have not only enriched the history of Hyde Park, but also the history of the Hudson Valley. Stoutenburg, Stringham, Marshall, Briggs, Van Wagner, DeGarmo, Doty, Barnes, Frost, Haviland, Terrell, Albertson, Wilbur, Browning, Barrett, and Ring. These are just some of the people, okay, that were part of the meeting house and continue to have their descendants, okay, be also part of the meeting house. Are there any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
How often did they meet?
They actually, it depended on they had a service once a week, but they also had monthly meetings, and they also had yearly meetings where a representative would travel to a yearly meeting. And there's an interesting story that actually happened before Crum Elbow was built. Two representatives from Crum Elbow were going to an annual meeting, and it was during the American Revolution. And they actually went to Flushing, New York. Now again, this is a story, so we don't know how true it is. But anyway, they went down and they had no problem going down. Coming home, they were able to go through the British lines. But when they came to the Continental Army lines, they wouldn't let them through. So they waited for a number of days before General Washington actually came to talk to them. And then he called Governor Clinton, and then they were allowed to return to Hyde Park, which was then probably still the town of Clinton. Any other questions? Yes.
Did they heat the winter? How did they heat the place?
Wood stoves. They're still...
Repeat the questions, because I can't hear.
Oh, okay. How did they heat the place? There are wood stoves. There are 2 wood stoves and they're still there. And that's originally why the chimneys were there, but the chimneys are now gone. Yes?
Where did the steps coming
Excuse me.
The steps in the building, where are they coming from?
Pardon?
Where are the steps in the building coming from?
The steps are either side. There's a second story.
Where people sit, prisoners?
What's on the second story, Carol?
Graduated benches on the second story.
Oh, the second story had graduated benches too. Okay, so that other people could be up there. But again, the women, went up one side and the men went up the other side. Any other questions?
When did they do away with that separation? Men and women, at what point?
As far as the Quakers themselves, I am not sure, to be honest with you. Denise, do you know? No. Okay, as long as this meeting house was used, there was a separation. And that, I don't know if with the rural...
Until when? You said as long as it was used.
This meeting house was actually used up until the late 1800s, and then the congregation started to dwindle, and that's when in 1913 it was deeded over to the Cemetery Association, and they have been responsible for the building ever since.
But they don't meet as Quakers.
No, not there. I'm thinking that the only Quaker meeting house that is currently has a congregation, and I could be wrong, but the one on Hooker Avenue. The Friends Meeting House on Hooker Avenue. Is there another one? Oh, Bull's Head. Okay. Those are the current only one. If you look at the map over on the table there, at one time, there were Quaker meeting house all over New York State. And yeah, there's a map on the table there that'll show you that. So, yeah. Yes.
Did the cemetery start in 1913 then?
Oh, no, the cemetery was there. John Briggs is buried there. Okay, the cemetery started when the meeting house started. Yes, so there are a number of early tombstones there. In fact, John Briggs's tombstone had deteriorated so badly that the family erected another one to make sure that everyone knew where he was.
What's the date on the stuff you have up there?
Pardon?
The date.
The date?
I recognize every one of those names.
That was 1933, I believe.
Yeah,
Yeah, so do you know them? Did you know them?
I knew every one of those people. I know Sterling Barrett, every one of them.
Oh, good. Yes,
So that's why I was working on it.
yes.
I was overhearing the gentleman said he knew every person that you mentioned. My question relates to his experience. The Quakers are conscientious objectors
Yes.
when it comes to wars. During the Quakers are conscientious objectors, and I was just wondering if Ralph knew of any of the Quakers who had served in World War II and became conscientious objectors and became they were in the military in different responsibilities other than fighting.
So, Ralph, he's asking if you knew any conscientious objectors who were Quakers.
I have 7 of my relatives are buried there. My grandmother and 7 of them.
So I guess he knew a few.
It was interesting because I have read some history, and though they did not fight, particularly in the wars, that did not mean that they didn't serve. Okay, even in the Revolutionary War, there were Quakers who at one time were Continental spies. Okay, they did not handle guns, they did not fight, but they were. And John Briggs, it's interesting, and I've got to research this more. In my research, he actually got a land grant for serving in the Revolutionary War. So I have no idea what he did, so I'm interested in researching to see exactly what he did in the Revolutionary War. Did you want to add to this?
Oh, I was just going to say that in some of the things that I have read, that the Quakers in other ways served, like Carol said. If they didn't, they were fined. They sometimes had to supply food to the armies and grow extra things. So they served in other ways, but if they did not get involved, they could be put in jail.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to have Denise take over and talk a little bit more about the restoration and preservation, and she's going to give you some insight into some of the people. You want this a little bit?
No, that's okay. Hi, my name is Denise Burns, and I was raised in property behind the meeting house as the crow flies east. My grandfather's farm had originally been a Van Wagner farm. So I brought a map of Pleasant Valley. The line just behind Crum Elbow Meeting House is Pleasant Valley. Just north is the town of Clinton. So I'm going to talk about the Crum Elbow community that is not only going to be Hyde Park, it's going to be Clinton, Pleasant Valley, and Hyde Park. As Carol said, when the Crum Elbow community started, Hyde Park didn't exist. It was the town of Clinton. I'm going to talk about why Crum Elbow matters, and one of the things that is of interest to me and hopefully to everybody here is that in the Olendow's mural that's in the post office has two parts of it that are connected to Crum Elbow. On panel 10, it has a painting that is supposed to be from about 1820, and it has the Crum Elbow Meeting House without the porch that was added. In the foreground is the Sheldon House, which is a farm that's still there. It's a pink house on the left side just before you get to Crum Elbow. On panel 13, there is it says the weekly Saturday trip to exchange farm produce, and it's a hay wagon with John Briggs and Isabel DeGroff. And this is 1870, and this is the grandson of the John Briggs who built the meeting house. So if you have a chance to go into the post office, take a look at Olendow's mural.
By the way,
Yes.
we provided that.
Oh, yes, I got this from you. Well, I got it from the museum. Yeah.
No, the post office has 100 of them now, and every time they run out, we give them another back.
They might need more. Get these another way. Oh, you did? Okay. Fergus Bordewich is an author who wrote several books about the Underground Railroad, and he made a connection between Crum Elbow community and the Guinea community in Hyde Park of freed slaves. A lot of people are not familiar, a lot of younger people especially, with knowing that there were over 2,000 slaves in the Hudson Valley. In school, I think it would be really important for children to learn about that rather than thinking of slavery only being in the South. So I'm hoping that some of the education that we can provide through Crum Elbow can help the community understand how important the Quakers were in Dutchess County. The philosophy, as Carol said, of the Quakers was social injustice, to love your neighbor as yourself, the golden rule, to treat people the way you wanted to be treated, and they were preparing for their admittance into heaven and their redemption. So slavery and pacifism, war, were two of the criteria for getting into heaven. I'm briefly going to talk about some people who are connected to the Crum Elbow community, and this letter from 1860 is by a Hyde Park woman who's buried in Crum Elbow, Lizzie DeGarmo. She had attended, it's a long letter, but ultimately she's saying that she attended a convention in Poughkeepsie with a lot of freed slaves and possibly even slaves, and that she was just so impressed by them and couldn't understand how these people could be in bondage. So as a woman at that time in 1860, women were not even given the right to vote until 1920. So I just consider her a very brave woman for coming forward and writing a letter like this. Susan B. Anthony was at this convention, and I just want to bring recognition to Lizzie DeGarmo at that time for having written a letter like this. I guess that's it. Carol mentioned John Briggs, her husband's relative, and he not only built the original part of the Quaker Meeting House, but his family donated land for a school. He was a wheelwright. He was a he had about 4 different occupations, which a lot of people did at that time. They just had to be very diverse in their abilities. But these were all people who contributed to the community and had a sense of lack of pretense, sense of service. Another person in the community was Edwin Barnes, who was an abolitionist. He was born in 1844. He attended public schools in Hyde Park. Everybody's heard of Samuel Bard, and when you look in an index under B, you won't find Edwin Barnes, but you'll find Samuel Bard. He was a physician, went to private school in Pleasant Plains at a private school that was taught by Sherman Hoyt. He went to Albany Medical College, and then the Civil War started. He was sent to the Army of the Cumberland and served as an assistant surgeon. After that, he practiced as a doctor in Pleasant Plains and the surrounding area. He was president of the Dutchess County Medical Society, vice president of the New York State Medical Society. He was a health officer in the town of Clinton, and his son Percy Barnes wrote the book Crum Elbow Folk that Carol has on the table. A wonderful book if anybody has a chance to get it from the library and read it. It talks about Quaker way of life around the time of 1820 to 1840. Another person who somehow was drawn to be interested in being buried in Crum Elbow is a famous photojournalist named Eugene Smith. He was born in 1918 and died in 1978. He was a photojournalist for Newsweek, New York Times, and Life magazine, went to Notre Dame University, and then moved to New York City. He was famous for his photo essays, and he had a strong sense of empathy and a social conscience. He had photographs of World War II, the Dust Bowl, and the clinic of Albert Schweitzer in Africa. When he was filming the invasion of Okinawa, his hands and face were injured by a grenade. He went on to live in Japan and did a famous photo essay of a small fishing village in Minamata, Japan, where water was poisoned by mercury. He was inducted into the Photography Hall of Fame and Museum in 1984. And for some reason, he's buried at Crum Elbow. Another interesting person in the Crum Elbow community at a later date is James Forrestal, who was Secretary of the Navy under Franklin Roosevelt during World War II. He was also the first U.S. Secretary of Defense. He, unfortunately, in 1949, fell from the 16th floor of Bethesda Naval Hospital and died. And there was a big mystery and scandal about whether he had committed suicide or had been murdered. And his house is on Marshall Road. Like Carol said, the community has a lot of interest, a lot of names. The local roads are Marshall Road, Ring Road, Browning Road, Ward Road, and a lot of those people are, the descendants are still, there's one right there, and there, of people from this community. Okay, I'm going to move on now to the condition assessment that we just had done by a contractor, and the reason that we're here trying to drum up interest in helping us with our project. In the fall, we raised $4,000 to have a contractor come in and do an assessment of the condition of the building. So I'm going to quickly go through some pictures that show needed repairs. And if anybody has any questions along the way, feel free to ask.
I have a question.
Yes?
Do they use this house for anything, meetings or anything anymore?
Right now, it's not, the question is it being used now? It's not, and that's what our hope is. It has a beautiful interior, 2 stories with 2 galleries upstairs. It's the last authentic meeting house in New York State. It has hardly changed since 1810, except for a galvanized roof was added to protect it, and the porch was added sometime, I don't know, 1920 or 1930. It's not being used. It has a full attic of bats, which I'm going to talk about in a little while, and that's our first project, is bat removal. So I will be talking about that. Okay, you can just go through those pictures of the interior and the exterior and the interior, and it describes what it is. The contractor took some pictures in different seasons and did the assessment over a couple of months. It's a beautiful building, and to answer your question, we'd like to see it used by the community for education and for tourism. But right now, it's not clean enough to take people inside until we clean up the bats and what they left behind. So this corner, the northeast corner, is a little bit sunken and collects water, so we need to put in a drainage system. It's on North Quaker Lane. So Quaker Lane is named after the community, which is significant. That's a picture of a hole in the floor where a woodchuck comes up. And these are the pews. So you can see they don't have cushions on them now, which is the original way they were, as Carol said. So that's one floorboard that needs to be fixed, and there are probably a few others. This is the hole outside where wildlife goes in to come up inside. This is showing some of the openings where bats and birds are getting in that need to be closed up, and that's the first project we need to work on, is to close up all the openings before we can get the bats out. We have to close that up and then have a wildlife nuisance person come and put in a one-way door. But before we can do that, we have to have bat houses made. So we have a scout who was here a little while ago who's going to be making bat houses for us. So through the DEC, there's a whole procedure that we have to follow. And we have to do that before July when the bats have their babies. There is a company that has old glass that is a possibility for replacing some of the glass that's there. It'll need to be determined at a future time, depending on what we can afford, of exactly how we're going to repair the glass. But most of the sills need to be repaired. Eventually, it will be painted, but that's not the first priority. Yes. On the east side, that had been a window that was directly over the outhouse. There's an outhouse on the east side that we're hoping to restore because that's part of the authenticity of it. So this is on the woman's side, and for whatever reason, they closed it up. Whether it was the odor from the privy or the girls looking down at the boys when they were going in there, I have no idea. But it's boarded up. This is the door on the left side, which is the west side, and this is not used right now. Usually the door on the east side is the one that you see open in pictures, and that's the one that's used. This is showing a little sag up above on the supporting beam. This is the same hole that we showed before where the woodchuck comes up. This on the top there is a closed over area where the flue had been for one of the wood stoves. There was a wood stove on each side, one on the east side, one on the west. But they're closed over now with some galvanized, right, metal. Sheet metal. This is the upstairs gallery that's not painted. No, there's no plumbing and no electricity. It will have to be used seasonally, and when we need to clean it, well, in the past they've brought a generator, and that's what we'll have to do. So it'll be a seasonal use building. When the contractor was there working one day in December, he said it was 14 degrees inside. This is a carving by Joel Wilbur. So this was one of the things that the contractor decided was proof that this was the boys' side. 1827. This is showing movable partitions that are on pulleys, and I've never seen them used. I think people might be afraid to use them because they're so old, but at some point the two sides could be closed off with these partitions. Everything is still there, and for people who are curious about that kind of arrangement, it's fascinating. The contractor was fascinated, the architect was fascinated with the construction and with some of the ingenuity. Okay, this is the bat. Oh, I'm sorry. This is circling a form called a gunstock form that the architect and the contractor were very interested in. The shape of that piece of wood is like a gunstock and is used as a brace. Is that right, Rich? Would it be a brace?
I've never seen it.
Oh.
But I've seen so.
I never heard of one, so I didn't know what it meant. The other sagging beam was the west side. This is the east side. So they're both sagging. This is a broken window boarded up with plywood. So our hope is that this can be preserved and repaired as well as we can so that it can be used by the public, because it's a fascinating building and the graveyard is fascinating. It's a pretty, very serene site. Oh, that's it? Okay. So thank you very much for coming. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
extent,
Area?
I know where Marshall Road is and Ring Road. You're talking about northern Poughkeepsie?
Cromwell Creek around the Pleasant Plains area, and that's where people started meeting. Mordecai Frost and John Underhill originally had meetings in their houses, but I don't know exactly when they started. Sometime 1770s to 1780s. And when land was donated on the meeting house's present location, they moved there, south on North Quaker Lane, and they kept the name Crum Elbow. But Crum Elbow is used, Crum Elbow Road goes from East Park to the intersection of Quaker Lane. There's a Crum Elbow Gun Club. There used to be a Crum Elbow Garden Club. It's a name that comes from the creek.
And also, can I just say, Crum Elbow is Dutch origin. It actually initially meant the bend in the Hudson River.
Yeah.
Okay, about 4 miles from Poughkeepsie up into Hyde Park. There's a bend in the river, and it's Crum Elbow, and that's Dutch. And that's what the original meaning was from.
It wasn't exactly Crum Elbow, but it was something like that, and people turned it into Crum Elbow because it made sense, right? It was something that sounded like Crum Elbow in Dutch. Yeah.
Actually, it's a combination of the Dutch and the English interpretation now. Okay. I could not Dutch, okay, but it's a similar type of thing. And then there is an English variation of it, so Crum Elbow is a combination of Dutch and English variation.
Other questions?
I just wanted to make a comment that we have still about 4 or 5 burials a year in the Crum Elbow Cemetery. And some of these are descendants of the original parishioners. Others are not, but there was a Methodist cemetery at one time in the late 1800s on Browning Road, and it was only in operation for a few years. And when it closed, those parishioners, there weren't many of them to begin with. It was a very small congregation, but they came to the Crum Elbow Meeting House at that point in time, even though they were not initially Friends or Quakers. And those descendants are also buried in the cemetery and continue to be.
Others?
I just really wanted to stress that this building needs to be saved. It's part of Hyde Park's history, and it had been used in the past for different things, and it can be used in the future, and definitely as an education piece for the children. It's just so important. So please, if you can help us to make a donation, that would be wonderful. If not, just kind of pass the word.
Speaking of donations, Denise, can you say what happened when I was late for our meeting?
Oh, sure.
Yes. I was looking for a brochure about the Olin Dow's mural in the post office, and the post office didn't have any. So I called the number on the door of the museum, and I...
Eventually got...
Yes. And what's your name? Kearney. I got Kearney, and he said he would meet me at the museum. So I went to the museum and sat on the bench and waited, and while I was waiting there, a tourist came along and started talking to me and wrote me a check for $100. So I was really glad that Kearney was late.
Shannon, you have a question?
Yeah, I can speak pretty loudly.
I can't.
We all have hearing problems.
So, first of all, is this site on the National Register of Historic Places?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Have you looked into a Sacred Places grant?
We're going to.
Okay. I'm just...
I do have to say something with that. It's very difficult to if you are not currently serving a congregation.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. We did a grant about, 10 years ago, 8 or 10 years ago, okay? And it was to the state or the federal government, one of them, okay? And we did not get the grant at that time, but we checked into the religious possibility of the grants. If you are not using it as a religious entity, it's very difficult to get that specific grant. We are looking at other grants, by the way, definitely, but that one's very difficult.
Thank you, yes, that's on our list.
We have a question way over.
Can you tell us what kind of cost estimates you have to refurbish? And also, what are some methods you're doing in order to fundraise, and how we can help?
Okay, we, in the fall, sent letters out to people that we knew and started with about $4,000 to pay the contractor for this assessment of what needed to be fixed. This is one of our kickoffs tonight for fundraising, and we have a grant writer who lives near me, a very experienced grant writer who's volunteering her time to apply for grants, and right now she's looking at the deadlines for the grants. So she has a spreadsheet of about 10 grants that we'll be applying to. Does that answer your question? What was your other question? Cost, okay. The contractor divided it into 3 sections. So the immediate priority was to install wire mesh at the eaves and close up any place where the wildlife is coming in. Inspect the metal roof ridge where rain can get in, install galvanized gutters and spouts because the ones there have failed, stabilize the ceiling joists, get rid of the bats and the bat guano, clean the gallery, clean the floors, remove debris, and remove the outhouse and the vestibule to the outhouse and replace it. The roof on the outhouse is the original, or what, I don't know if it had ever been replaced, possibly, but ultimately we want to have cedar shingles. That's authentic. So the main meeting house has a galvanized roof now, but the outhouse still has cedar shingles. So he's suggesting taking that down and replacing it. So this is priority 1. This is the immediate need. And the estimate is between $11,000 and $15,000. The second priority is a whole list of getting an engineer and making some long-lasting repairs and replacing the windows, and that's between $35,000 and $42,000. Priority 3 is roof restoration with cedar, exterior restoration and painting, and completing the restoration of the windows, and that's $105,000 to $125,000. So the total is $182,000. It's a lot. It'll be a many-year project.
Who is the contractor?
The contractor, I'm so sorry I didn't mention his name. He's wonderful. His name is Matt Alexander. He's from Hyde Park. He's a graduate of Roosevelt High School, 1994. He's a great guy. And this assessment was so thorough and so professional, the grant writer was so impressed. He's wonderful. Very conscientious. He wouldn't even chew gum in there. Yes.
You want to mention about the problem with bats and why you can't just get an exterminator?
Oh, sure. The question is the bats and why we can't just get an exterminator. Bats in New York State are protected because the population is down. We were supposed to determine whether they were small brown bats or large brown bats, and it was determined that they were large brown bats. But in any case, they are somewhat protected. They have their babies in July, so they can't be removed during the winter while they're hibernating. There's a small window of opportunity to remove them in May and the beginning of June, and after that we can't do it. So we have a scout who was here a little while ago, Corey, who's going to be building bat houses. And then a wildlife nuisance person comes and will go with the contractor and put in a one-way door, and then the bats will have a place to go, hopefully. But there's a big population in the attic, a big healthy population according to the contractor. Did that answer your question? Thanks. Yes. This is Don Traver, and Don is the president of the Cemetery Association at Crum Elbow.
I'm the person who decides where you're going to be buried. Sometimes a very difficult problem. I just wanted to speak about the ceiling in the house. It's as Denise said, it's probably one of the very few original Quaker meeting houses in New York State that is in the original condition. And I shouldn't tell you this, but 5 or 6 years ago, 2 or 3 of us actually tried those doors, and they're in the center of the building. They separate, I'm using this building here as an example, they separate the ladies' side from the men's side, and you grab these doors and they come down. And they apparently have weights on them because you push them and they go up. And we didn't pull them all the way down. I just wanted to see, do they still work, and they do. A lady over here said, where do the stairs go? This is an interesting feature. I did a little reading on this, and I found out that you went up the stairs, as you saw in the picture here. That's a good picture. Hold on. And the ceiling is, I'm going to use this building as an example. From that corner, it's graduated more steeper than this is, maybe down to the exit sign. And as you went, when you got upstairs, there were benches, as here, graduated down quite steeply. And then here comes the question: the people sitting upstairs, they couldn't hear what was being said downstairs, if anything was being said. What happened? There's an interesting feature. The ceiling over here was hinged. They had hinges over here, and they apparently had ropes and pulleys, and they pulled that part of the ceiling up. And then the people sitting up here could look down. Now, they couldn't see the people in all the benches here, but they could see the elders, maybe, or whoever was sort of in charge of the meeting. They could see those particular seats. And it's now been closed up. There are no pulleys or ropes. There are no hinges. It's my idea that they closed that up because nobody was using upstairs. And also the stairways have doors on them that will close them up, keep the heat downstairs. The 2 stoves are there, pitiful stoves. If those stoves were run red hot, it would just take the chill off. But they were there anyway. But that, I was very interested in how they decided to give access to the people upstairs so they could see or hear what was going on downstairs. And I'm very interested in seeing the building preserved because it's got so many unique features that are there today. And we can save it, hopefully.
Okay, thank you very much. This was a wonderful turnout. Thank you.
I got to say, this is one of our better meetings that we've had. We have an envelope. I'm not sure exactly what's in it, but we're going to give that to our speakers. And I think that I know we're going to have a board of directors meeting in May, and we'll be discussing something with that too. Herb's waving.
I hope I'm in the field of view of the camera. Crum Elbow Cemetery, is that the one up by Hollow and North Quaker?
It's North Quaker going toward Hollow, yes.
Okay.
On the right side if you're going north. It's not the one you're thinking of.
Now, there's a cemetery on Hollow as you head east, not quite to the church. Well, at any rate, it's close enough. I was there many years ago, and I was looking at some of the inscriptions. And there's one which I understand was pretty popular back then, and I remember it quite well. And it says, "Behold and see, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so ye shall be. Prepare for death and follow me." Heartwarming, isn't it?
Okay, we're running a little late. I do have a 3-minute story I would like to tell. When Tatiana and I were working on this Moscow street map in the English language, we had to go back and forth to Moscow, Russia, several times. I lived there for about a year total. And at the time we were doing that, we lived in Norwich, which is near Oneonta in the Catskill Mountains, northern end of the Catskill Mountains. And Oneonta has an active Quaker meeting. And they decided, this was right during perestroika at the end of the Cold War, the first Cold War. And they decided they'd make a peace quilt. This was a huge quilt. It was like 15 feet by 15 feet. I don't know what they thought the Russians were going to do with it once they sent it. But they asked Tatiana and I to take this quilt to the Moscow meeting. And we made arrangements when we got to Moscow to meet somebody at a street corner near the Kremlin. And it was a Russian Orthodox cathedral. And so we thought, well, this is great. We're going to be inside this cathedral for this Quaker meeting. And, well, they met us at the corner. They led us down the stairway into the cellar. And there was one light hanging from the ceiling with a bare light bulb. And we all sat down. There were about 15 or 20 of us. And just like I guess Carol mentioned, you would sit there until the Lord told someone to speak. And I think we sat there for about 15 minutes. And then finally somebody spoke, and they were speaking in Russian, and Tatiana translated for me. I know a little more Russian now than I did back then. And finally I presented the quilt to these people, and I kept thinking, what are they going to do with this? This was during the deficit economy. Probably when Tatiana and I left the meeting, they'd be taking scissors and cutting pieces of that quilt. But it's the same thing in Moscow, Russia today as what you're talking about 100 years ago in America. So I'm really happy with the program that went on today.
Denise, you might want to mention who people make a check out to.
Yeah, there's envelopes on some of the seats. They're not all on the seats.
Yeah, if you need one of these cards, yeah, you make it out to the Crum Elbow Rural Cemetery Association because the meeting house is owned by them. So if you need any of these cards, let me know. Oh, and yes, there is a Facebook page. You find it by Crum Elbow Rural Cemetery, and then it will show that. Yes, Karen?
Just make sure you are donating to the preservation.
Okay.
So that we can say it's dedicated to the preservation and it's not just for...
Yeah, on the card it says for meeting house preservation. So if you need a card, if you're making a donation, I have more. Thank you.
So I'm wondering, how do you know a meeting's over? Did they go by an hour? Because you're just sitting there waiting. How do they know when this is over?
When the spirit moves them.
Yeah. Patsy just pointed out, Patsy Costello just pointed out.
A signal that the meeting was over. All done silent.
Patsy just mentioned that we did have a meeting out there. Would you like to talk? All right. I think it was about 10 years ago. I remember Bob Gilbert was our guide, and he showed us some of the headstones in the cemetery, and we went inside, and it was quite interesting. We sat there quietly for a while.
You could hear the squirrels, up in the next story, but nobody got struck to say anything. So but we did have a meeting there, our organization.
Actually, the squirrels might have been bats, so we don't know. Okay, we're going to break for refreshments, and the coffee urns were making noise during the program, so Jenny Bickford was kind enough to take them into the kitchen, but we might be a little late with the coffee, but at least we can get the other refreshments. Oh, wait, just a second. Okay, we have another presentation. I saw it here a while ago. Yes. I'm going to give this envelope, which I don't know what's inside of it, to Herb Sweet. Okay. All right, so now we're all set. You can break into your eating mode.